Take a step back in history and you'd find a very different Singapore to what you know today. As part of the country's Bicentennial commemoration, one of Southeast Asia's oldest museums is opening its vaults for a deeper look at the natural history heritage of Singapore and the region.
200, a natural history, showcases over 400 specimens from natural history. They form part of the vast collection that's been preserved at the NUS Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum since 1849.
Each tells a unique tale of the biodiversity history of Singapore and the region. Kicking off the launch of the exhibition, Minister for Culture, Community and Youth, Grace Fu, underlined the role the Natural History Museum plays in fostering heritage.
You help us understand and appreciate our natural environment better and inform us of the impact on our biodiversity as we embark on infrastructural development. Through creative and educational programs, museums lay the foundations for a lifelong interest in heritage and culture.
Singapore may be a metropolis now, but what if I could take you back through the pages of natural history to a time when many more things crept and crawled, and when even tigers roamed the island? For our first stop on that journey, though, I have to take you back to the mid-1800s. Follow me. Most of the recorded story of the region's natural history begins with the arrival of the British and the ambitions of the East India Company. It includes the familiar names of two men from the pages of Singapore's past: Thomas Stamford Raffles and William Farquhar. Now, these two men were contemporaries, but they were also bitter rivals. They both had an intense interest for something that many Europeans had at the time in the 1800s, a great propensity and interest for collecting specimens, flora and fauna from the wild, whether from the land or from the sea. And these company men found the time to explore and investigate the tropical abundance that surrounded them. Back in 1819, when the British arrived in Singapore, they would have discovered an island covered in lush, untouched rainforest and seas that were pristine. It was in that year that Stamford Raffles and a Major General from the East India Company, his name was Thomas Hardwick, they went on a sea excursion. They went to see what they could find in the waters around the island, and they discovered this rather magnificent specimen. It came to be known as the Neptune cup, the first named animal in Singapore. It was presumed extinct until about 2011. Hungry for adventure, it was also that sea trip which saw Raffles catching and eating an animal deemed vulnerable today.
The dugong which we examined measured 8.5 feet in length and afforded no less interest under the knife than satisfaction on the table, as the flesh proved to be most excellent beef. Our entertainment was truly marine, for we had on the same day discovered those Neptunian sponges, and which served us as goblets.
It wasn't just Raffles who had an appetite for gastronomic escapades. You know man versus wild, but how about woman versus wild? Circa 1852. This Austrian explorer started a journey around the world and ended up in the Malay archipelago. While on her boat trip, the crew made an unexpected discovery on board. The sailors pulled its skin off and were then going to throw it into the sea, but I advised them not to do that, but to eat it. And with that challenge issued, Ida Pfeiffer cut off a large chunk, devouring it with enthusiasm in front of her bemused crew. Many early explorers like Ida could be credited with discovering and naming new species in the animal kingdom, all made on their daring voyages.
There's so many anecdotes of old that you can look through and see through a different lens. There are so many stories that we've unearthed. This is just a few things. This is one thing per year, but there would have been hundreds of things. Yeah, so I really want people to come in and feel that it's full of things like tragedy and you know, intrigue and romance. When we tell stories, they are history too.
And spanning 200 years, the exhibition includes stories bizarre and bold, of theories gone awry, like this French naturalist's observation of fish falling out of the sky after a heavy thunderstorm, to the raucous menagerie races that were held in 1881. Clearly few rules as to the choice of animals entering the race. And a darker reality, that of the trade of live animals, a business that once thrived on our shores.
We feel that these 200 things are a good representation of what has happened in Singapore's natural history over the past 2 centuries. Things like colonialism, agriculture, exploration, the animal trade, for example. And these are all things we cannot escape from. They are part of what makes Singapore, Singapore today.
Nothing tells the story of the bitter rivalry of William Farquhar and Sir Stamford Raffles quite like this little guy, the Malayan tapir. It's been chosen as the emblem for the 200 years of natural history exhibition, partly because it signifies a rush and a competition to discover and to describe. And that's what they both wanted, to be the very first to describe this animal for the history books. But in the end, both men were pipped to the post by the efforts of 2 French collectors hired by Raffles himself. The duo took the research of Raffles and Farquhar to French naturalist Baron Cuvier, who now holds the honor of naming Tapirus indicus. One objective of the East India Company was economic. What valuable crops could thrive in the tropical climes of the region? What resources in nature could be harvested and used? Singapore's history of rubber plantations is well known, less so that of gutta percha. Demand for the natural plastic rose exponentially after 1825, used mostly to insulate submarine telegraph cables. It led to the near extinction of the trees that the gutta percha came from. By the 1900s, the invention of synthetic plastics almost entirely obliterated the need and the demand for gutta percha. Unfortunately, by that time, many of the trees from which the gutta percha had been sourced, the Palacium trees, had been felled here in Singapore. But I have heard that on a long walk in the forest, you might still find 1 or 2 that still exist. Science generally agrees that knowledge of our natural history heritage may be the best way to ensure that what remains stands a good chance of surviving into the future. Many early explorers of Southeast Asia, like the Saracen cousins, who at first hunted the forests, went on to become the pioneers of conservation. Today, many of us who care about preservation and protection of species and have a good understanding about conservation know that it was the early hunters, otherwise known as the shikars, who first articulated the dangers of habitat loss. They spent so much time in the forest that they soon came to understand the fragility of nature.